Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have reached a major milestone for a YouTube creator. I want to share with you one of my older sweaters, which will become part of my long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade from the 1890s to the 1990s. And I want to talk a little bit about my next vintage sweater project. So let's get started. In most of my Casual Friday videos, I include a segment of what I call tidbits, where I share things that I've come across in my social media feed that I think might be interesting to you. I'm cutting back on those a little bit for the next few weeks. I'm saving some of them up in anticipation when I'm going to be on the road a bit and may not be able to upload as much in progress content as I normally do. So if you're missing tidbits this week, never fear. I'm just saving things up for you, and you will get those tidbits. And if any of you have a tidbit that you would like to share that you think might be interesting to the Casual Friday audience, please, you can leave those down in the comments. You can send me an email. My email address is on my channel About page, or you can send me a direct message on Ravelry as well. Those are all great ways of sharing tidbits with me and with the audience. Well, this past week I hit a milestone for my YouTube channel. I hit 100,000 subscribers. So this is often seen as a really big deal for YouTube channels, and in some ways it is, and in other ways it really changes nothing in terms of what happens to me or what I'm going to be doing on the channel. But I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what it actually does for me for sure. And that is, number one, my channel is now verified. That's something that you have to have 100,000 subscribers to do. And if you want to have YouTube verify that you are the person who is actually creating the content, that the face that you see on the channel banner is the actual person who's creating the content, they will verify that. And that's pretty simple to do. In the case of my channel, it's my face on the banner. It's my face and voice talking to the camera. Easy to verify. Some channels you never see the creator's face. They might be posing as somebody else potentially. I don't know. So it's pretty easy to verify my channel and get the little check mark next to my channel name. The thing that many people are familiar with in terms of what happens when you hit 100,000 subscribers is that you get the silver play button. It's a plaque that YouTube sends you with your channel name on it, and they can send you a congratulations letter. They don't send that to you automatically. What happens is that once you reach 100,000 subscribers, they will review your channel and look to see that, first of all, you've uploaded content in the past, I don't know, 6 to 12 months, so that you are currently active member of the YouTube community, that there actually is content on your channel, that there aren't just somehow 100,000 subscribers and no public content to be seen, that you haven't violated any of the YouTube community guidelines, and that you don't have any copyright strikes against your channel, all of that kind of thing. And once they have reviewed that, and it can take a while because with the number of channels that continually reach this milestone, it can take a while for that review to be finalized. So once that happens, then they'll email me congratulations, and then they'll invite me to fill out the form so that I can get my plaque. So what I thought I would do is that when I do get my when I get my plaque, for that I can answer questions that you guys might have about what it means to be a YouTube creator, anything that you might want to know behind the scenes, like how does monetization work, how do I get paid, that kind of thing, if that's of interest. Things like how long does it take me to make a video, what is my process for making videos, anything that's sort of behind the scenes, whether it's the actual creating the product or whatever goes on the YouTube platform itself from a creator standpoint that you wouldn't necessarily, or you wouldn't ever be able to see. I'm happy to answer any of those kinds of questions. So like I said, once my review is completed and I filled out the form, it'll take a number of weeks before I get the plaque. But once I do, I'll do either a live stream or I'll just do a segment on Casual Friday. I'm not sure which yet, but I'll answer those questions for you. And so if you have any, go ahead and you can leave those down below and I'll see what might be of interest to people, because sometimes it's just all mysterious and sometimes you have very specific questions like, how does this work or how does that work? And I'd be happy to explain that to you. Last week, I finished my 1970s sweater, which was part of this long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade from the 1890s to the 1990s. And somebody asked me in the comments if I would talk about my 1980s sweater. I had decided in the past few months that I wasn't going to knit a 1980s sweater because I learned to knit in the 1980s and I actually have a sweater in my wardrobe that I do still wear occasionally. I knit, I think in about 1990-ish, maybe 89. I'm not sure exactly when I knit this, but it turns out it was designed in 1987 by a designer, Welsh designer named Sasha Kagan. And I really feel like in many ways it epitomizes sweaters from that era in that it has this overall intarsia design, those really common kind of oversized. This is considered a jacket rather than a cardigan, so it is meant to be, I think, a little roomier. And it's associated with an actual designer name. So this is something that I've kind of come to realize as I've been working through this project, and I looked at who was producing patterns, how they were presented, and then getting to the 1970s and seeing that Elizabeth Zimmerman and Barbara Walker were specific people, specific names associated with ways of knitting sweater that were different than what had been presented before. And not only was were the sweaters constructed differently, but the way they explained how to knit them was explained differently. It was, here's how you make a sweater that fits you. It isn't, here's a sweater pattern for a 36-inch bust and here are all the numbers, and if it doesn't fit you, too bad. You have to either live with it or figure it out on your own. These two women were explaining, here's a process for knitting a sweater for an individual person. So that was very different. And the more I was thinking about it, the more I realized that when I learned to knit in the 1980s, I bought a lot of books that had patterns in there, colorful patterns. And many of them were associated with a specific designer's name. Some of the first knitting books I bought were of Kafe Fassett designs. They're basically like coffee table books. He was a painter who then learned to knit and was using yarns basically as a palette. And this sweater was designed by a Welsh designer named Sasha Kagan, who also used Rowan yarns the same way that Kafe Fassett did in her designs. And she just had all of these intarsia designed sweaters, but they were under her name. I have two books that she wrote, including one that had this sweater in it, which I just loved. And I never thought I'd be able to knit it because the number of colors involved and trying to get things that would work together that were the same yarn weight and the colors wouldn't clash. I'm slightly colorblind. It really intimidates me to try to find something from a different company or multiple companies that are going to work together. I just felt like there was no hope of that. And then there was a yarn shop that was downtown Minneapolis that was closing down. And I think it was the first year that I lived here, my sister-in-law, who's a knitter, said, oh, there's this yarn shop you want to go to, and they're going to have this big sale. So we were walking through there, and there on the floor was a kit for this sweater in the colorway that I wanted, because it was represented a couple different colorways in the book. And I couldn't believe my luck, and it was like half price or something. And so I scooped it up, and I took it home. I couldn't have been more thrilled at the coincidence of being able to get my hands on this particular kit. So I had learned to knit in 1986, and so when I came across this kit was probably 1989, very early, somewhere around there. The sweaters in that era had pretty simple shaping. So I tended to choose my patterns based on learning something, and it was usually a type of stitch pattern. I've never done texture before. I'm going to do a knit purl pattern and learn how to do that. I've never done cables before. I'm going to do a sweater that has that. I've never done a cardigan. I'm going to learn how to do button bands, that kind of thing. And so I was doing all kinds of things for color work and really falling in love with texture and color work too, which was really popular at the time. One of the things that I'm going to have to go back and look through the pattern and see what it says about certain techniques. But one thing that I can see by looking at the decreases on either side of this V-neck is that I used knit two together on both sides. And I remember that was something that at the time always confused me. If they said decrease, if they just said decrease at the, at this point or this point, I probably would have just used a knit two together. And I can remember looking at certain sweaters and thinking, I really like the way everything looks on this side of the neckline, but I don't like the way it looks at that side. And I didn't know how to change it. If a pattern specifically told me to use a decrease like slip one, knit one, pass the slip stitch over, I would have done it and liked the result, but I wouldn't have understood why I was doing that. I just did what I was told. So slip one, knit one, pass slip stitch over is a left leaning decrease, which is the opposite of a knit two together. These days, most often you'll see patterns specifying SSK, which is slip two stitches one at a time as if you were knitting, because that will change the stitch mount, and then work them together. That also creates a left leaning decrease. It's just a different process. When I learned to knit, it was slip one, knit one, pass slip stitch over. It turns out it was Barbara Walker who invented the SSK back in like 1969 or something, but it just took a few decades for it to really catch on. So that's one of the things I can see. I know I had done pockets before, so that wasn't something that would have been new to me with this sweater. What would have been new was the fact that at the tops of these sleeves there's ribbing instead of just being joined. Like that's what was distinguishing this as a jacket as opposed to a cardigan in Sasha Kagan's sweaters. There wasn't anything that was particularly difficult about this sweater in terms of its construction because it's just pretty basic, oversized, modified drop shoulder. The thing that was the big challenge and the thing that this sweater taught me, and that I could take that lesson with me when I was working in this bigger project of a century of knitting, was that the number of motifs that there were in a given row. If we look at the back of this sweater, there are some rows on this sweater back where there were 30 different color changes. And this isn't stranded across, this is color block. So you keep the strand with that little motif. You don't strand it across. Sasha Kagan did kind of advocate a combination of stranding and intarsia when it made sense. In something like this, she probably would have said, knit this kind of tan color over here, knit the fuchsia, and then use the same strand that you use for tan on this side. She probably would have done something like that. I may or may not have done that. But one of the things that I realized early on was that I really had to pay attention to the color chart when I was knitting. And I like to take my knitting to work, and I would sit in the lunchroom with other people and chat. And I just couldn't focus on the knitting while I was there. And what I also realized was there were going to be a lot of yarn tails to weave in. And so I realized pretty early on that I could only knit at home where I could concentrate. And then I could use my lunch hours to weave in yarn tails. And that was going to be my only hope of making sure that the yarn tails got woven in. So when I did my 1920s sweater, which is this sweater right here with all of this color work on it, I knew from the start there were going to be a lot of ends. I actually calculated how many yarn tails there were going to be. And I said, and there was going to be over 500 of them or something. And I thought, oh, I have to have a plan for weaving in the yarn tails. I don't have this at home, at work situation. So I'll just make a plan that for everyone, every time I finish, you know, one or two of these horizontal bands, I will weave in those yarn tails. And so for the most part, I did follow that plan, and it made finishing the sweater. There was enough, you know, finishing work going on in that sweater. I didn't also need to weave in yarn tails. So that was something that I learned from this sweater, was that when you have that many yarn tails, find a way to deal with them as you go, because you're not going to avoid yarn tails in this sort of situation. I posted a picture of this sweater on Twitter the other day. There's on Wednesday afternoons in the UK, or it's in the evenings in the UK, it's the afternoon here. There's something called Wool Hour, and they say post what you're knitting on with wool this, or what you're working on with wool this week. So some people are spinning, some people are weaving, doing whatever. And I posted my 1970s sweater, and somebody said something about, are you going to get started on your 1980s sweater right away or take a break? And I said, oh, I already have it. And I posted a picture of this. It was flat. And so you could see the back side of the back. You could see the wrong side of the back. And somebody said, oh, that's very neat. And I explained, yeah, I had to have a plan for it. So I want to go to the overhead, and I'll do some little close-ups of this particular sweater so you can see some of the elements that it includes. So as I look at this sweater closely, I don't really remember what I learned at the time. I mean, I remember realizing I needed to deal with the ends while I was knitting it and not wait till the end. That I have a clear memory of. But I don't really remember what I learned while I was knitting this sweater. In many ways, it was very similar to a lot of other sweaters I knit at this time, and it's very kind of oversized, basic shape. There were elements that I hadn't seen in sweaters before, like the ribbing, the twisted ribbing at the tops of the sleeve caps and the tops of the shoulders. This was something that Sasha Kagan did. This is what made something a jacket, and it was more oversized than a cardigan. So for her, a cardigan would have been maybe a little bit smaller for the same size, and you wouldn't have had this ribbing at the top. So that's something that I remember was different than I had done before, but I don't know that it was something I learned. But when I look at how this was constructed and the techniques that I used as I was knitting it, I can see how much I've learned since I knit this. So I'm still really, quite proud of the finished result of this. I'm happy to wear this sweater occasionally. I'm not embarrassed by it or think, oh my gosh, look at all those mistakes. What I see is evidence of a knitter who just doesn't know as much as she knows now. So one of those things is with the way that the decreases were worked along these edges. So on this side, if I look at these stitches here, let me get up closer. So if I look at the decreases, I can see by looking at two stitches that are next to each other that the stitch on the left is sitting on top of the stitch to the right. So that when I decreased, this one ended up on top. Well, that's a knit two together. It's a right-leaning decrease. But what I did over here was also a right-leaning decrease. So I did a knit two together on both sides. And so on this side, you don't get that kind of line, defined line of decreases, but on this side, you do. The other thing that I can see that I remember frustrated me when I was knitting at this time, not just with this sweater, but just in general. So I would have used a long tail cast on. And you can see that it's a long tail cast on by looking on the back side where all of the smooth stitches are. And on the front, you get those purl bumps at the base of all of the columns. So I'm sure that the instructions instructed to cast on, and then row one was a right side row. And then they would have instructed to knit this stitch pattern a certain number of of rows and then go into the stockinette, and that would leave this bumpy edge on the right side of the work. What I didn't realize is that I could work an extra row or one row fewer, and so that to force that smooth side on the right side of the work. Of course, you have to be careful if there's a specific type of stitch that needs to be at the beginning or end, and if that's going to change if you work an extra row and have the other side facing. But the other option would have been for me to cast on in pattern. So if it was going to be a knit column, I would do a long tail cast on using the knit stitch. And if it was a purl column, I would cast on in purl. You can do that. Or if I wanted the smooth side under, the smooth edge that I have on this reverse side right now, if I'd wanted that smooth edge along the entire thing, I could have done a reverse long tail cast on in order to force that and also still have row 1 be the right side row. So I have a lot of choices that I could get around that I just didn't know what to do back then. And if you're wondering how to cast on in knit purl pattern or in a reverse so that you have the purl bumps ending up on the back side of row 1, I'll link to some videos up here. The other thing that I can see is if I look at the side seam, it doesn't look terrible. You can tell that there is a seam there. But when I look on the inside of the work and I look closely at what kind of a seam I used, I can see that I used backstitch. And that was, some of my early knitting books would say to do that, and certainly that was what the advice was in knitting books up to at least the 1930s or so, until the gauges of sweaters got much, much finer. And so they were advising ways to get less bulky seams. It wasn't mattress stitch, but it wasn't backstitch anymore. And so I can see that was the way that I was seaming back then. And these days I wouldn't use that method of seaming. I would have chosen a different method. But still, it's acceptable. You expect to see a seam at the side of a sweater, and you can see that there is a seam, but it doesn't look terrible. So I'm not embarrassed by what I'm seeing. Another thing I see, like the cuffs and also the front button bands, there's this, this different color that starts it. And what you can see in the purl columns are these little blips of color. And that's a result of, transitioning from one color to another. You're going to see those color blips on the purl side of the fabric. But there is a way of avoiding that kind of thing, which is when you change to the new color, you work that first row in stockinette. And so it forces all of the purl bumps onto the back side of the fabric, and then you resume working your ribbing pattern on the following row. So you can avoid those color blips when you change colors like this using that technique. I'll link to that up there. So I can see all kinds of things that I would do differently today, but the techniques that I used at the time don't destroy the sweater. They don't really detract. They are just little refinements that take a sweater to the next level, but they aren't things that most people are even going to notice, let alone comment on. So I am still very happy with this sweater, even after taking a really close-up look at it. So it turns out that I don't have a sweater from the 1990s in my wardrobe because I had babies in the 1990s and I was knitting for them. I was knitting for my niece and my nephew. I knit for various family members. I don't think I knit a sweater for myself in the 1990s. And when I was thinking about it, I'm like, I don't even know what would distinguish a sweater from the 1990s from one from the 80s. Like, I just don't, I'm not able to kind of think of fashion-wise what really would have been significantly different. If anybody can think of something, please let me know down in the comments. I kind of took a knitting hiatus in the very early 2000s. I wasn't knitting much at all. And when I came back to knitting in 2005, there was like Knitty was an online knitting magazine. I found sweaters on there that I knit that I really liked. So those are from the early 2000s. And then Ravelry started a couple of years after that. And what I was noticing on Ravelry, because a lot of those people were quite a bit younger than I was, they were people who were internet savvy or, computer savvy and used the internet a lot like I did, but they, were younger. And I was noticing that there were a lot of people that were knitting very, very tight sweaters with a lot of negative ease. And people hadn't quite caught on to bust starts or waist shaping. They were knitting the sweater body completely one size, but they wanted to have negative ease in their waist, which meant that for their bust, there was a ridiculous amount of negative ease to the point where cables were not lining up vertically on their sweaters. So there was a lot more closer fitting sweaters in the early 2000s. So that there was a real shift at that point. But one of the things that I've been noticing as looking for resources, particularly for the 1970s, was to try to figure out when some of the books that I have on traditional knitting were published. So I do have some books from the 1970s that were on like Scandinavian or Norwegian or Fair Isle knitting, but it was really interesting to see that those 1970s books were not knitting them in the traditional way. They were using traditional motifs that you would find in Fair Isle knitting or Norwegian knitting, but they were constructing them in those bottom-up flat in pieces and then seaming them constructions. I have an Alice Starmore book that was published in the late 70s on Scandinavian knitting, and it's all done in pieces. So I thought, well, that's interesting. When did that shift? And what I noticed was that a lot of the books that I have on traditional knitting, whether it's Fair Isle, Gansey's, Erin, whatever it is, those were published in the 80s and the 90s. That's when you start to see people publishing books about knitting history, like Richard Rutt's book on the history of hand knitting. He was UK, real academic book. First time somebody did an academic study of knitting and put all that stuff together. And that was in the 80s. So the other thing that happened in the 80s was the UK, although the UK may have started at the very, very end of the 70s, but either the end of the 70s or early 80s, the UK founded the Knitting and Crochet Guild of the UK. Here in the US, the first Knitters Guild was the Madison Knitters Guild, which is in Madison, Wisconsin, which is where Elizabeth Zimmerman's influence was. She was living in Wisconsin, so there was all this, her sweater camps and her knitting camps that were often done on university campuses at the beginning. There was that huge influence of Elizabeth Zimmerman, I imagine, in terms of getting that Madison Knitters Guild going. And then, like within a year or two after that, the Knitting Guild Association, which is the national guild here in the U.S., they started as an educational organization, and the first course that they started, or program that they started, was the Master Hand Knitting program. And now they have a bunch of other correspondence courses they're aimed at educating knitters at all different levels. So, and then you start to see guilds popping up everywhere. The Minnesota Knitters Guild started at some point in the mid to late 80s as well. So that is really interesting to me, that in the 80s, what you see is Knitters Guilds, books on traditional knitting, and name designers, like all of that stuff changed in the 80s. From what I have heard, there was this rise in popularity of hand knitting in the 80s, and then it started to go down in the 90s, which I didn't notice because I was a solitary knitter and I was just knitting what I wanted to knit. And I had I live in the Twin Cities. There's many, many yarn shops here. I could find yarn shops all over the place. There were 2 of them within walking distance of my house for many, many years. So that has been very interesting to me. And these traditional knitting garments were not the garments that were put in writing back in the 1890s. So these are the garments that existed either side by side with those 1890s written patterns, or maybe came before them, some of them after that. But they were things that weren't necessarily documented in print. They were just things that people learned from each other, and they didn't get documented until the 1980s and 1990s, which I think is fascinating. And so for me, my thought is that my 1990s sweater will be a traditional sweater that goes back to the era before written patterns, and that are sort of the precursors of the actual written sweater patterns. So I think that'd be a nice way to circle around, and also circle around within my own knitting education that started in the 1980s. So that's my thought. Let me know what you think might be a good idea for that 1990s sweater, what knitting tradition. I'm leaning towards something with stranded colorwork, since I didn't do that for my 1970s, and I have several intarsia colorwork patterns that I have done. I haven't done anything cabled, and that tends to be my real love. I don't know that there's a lot for me to learn about from knitting a cabled sweater. I've designed so many of them myself. I think that the stranded colorwork is probably the thing that I should do as part of this particular project. But let me know what you think. And my impulse would be to do something with Shetland wool in the Farrell tradition, not Norwegian. I find Norwegian knitting, it's beautiful to look at. I just find it less interesting to me, because it tends to be like too high contrast colors, and I would be interested in pushing myself to mix more colors, because that is something that is hard for me and intimidating for me, and I would like to push myself in that direction. But let me know what you think about my idea for my 1990s sweater. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any tidbits to share, any questions about YouTube, or any comments about what I should do about my 1990s sweater, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.